The rattle of the wheels had become a part of her, a dull, thrumming ache in her bones that had worked its way up from the hard wooden bench, through her spine, and into the base of her skull. For 6 days, it had been her only constant companion, aside from the relentless sun and the fine, pale dust that coated everything. It was a dust so pervasive it seemed to rise from the very floorboards of the stagecoach, a ghost of the parched land they crossed. Mabel pressed her forehead against the cool, vibrating glass of the window, her gaze lost in the endless expanse of ochre and brown. The year was 1891, and out here, the world felt unfinished, as if the Creator had sketched the mountains in the far distance and then left the rest to the wind. The wind was the true architect of this land. It sculpted the low-slung hills, bent the lonely, skeletal trees, and etched deep lines into the faces of the people who dared to call this place home. It was a land that demanded resilience, and at 42, Mabel believed resilience was the one thing she had in abundance. Her hands, resting in the lap of her dark gray traveling dress, were not the soft, idle hands of a lady. The skin was chapped, the knuckles slightly swollen, the nails cut short and practical. They were hands that had dressed wounds on boys barely old enough to shave, hands that had held down screaming men as a surgeon sawed through bone, hands that had cooled feverish brows and, more often than she cared to remember, closed the eyes of the dead. The war had taken her youth, stripping it away in the blood and grime of field hospitals. It had left her with a quiet sort of emptiness and a head of hair more salt than pepper. The silver strands that framed her temples didn't bother her. They were earned, each one a testament to a life that had been spent in service to the suffering of others. But that life was over. Now, she was traveling toward a different kind of service, a different kind of life. Tucked inside her worn leather reticule was a clipping from a newspaper. The paper so creased and folded it was soft as linen. The ink was faded, the words simple and stark. Widower, respected blacksmith, of good standing, seeks a plain, honest woman of mature years for the purpose of matrimony. Must be willing to mother a young child. No triflers need apply. Inquire via letter to Silas Banning, Dust Creek. Mabel had read those words 100 times. Mature years. That had been the phrase that caught her eye. It was an admission that youth and beauty were not on the list of requirements. Plain, honest woman. She could be that. She had never been a beauty, not even in her youth. Her face was pleasant enough, with high cheekbones and clear gray eyes that saw things as they were, not as she wished them to be. Honesty was the bedrock of her character. As for mothering a child, her heart, which she had thought long barren of such tender feelings, gave a strange, unfamiliar flutter. After a lifetime of tending to the broken bodies of men, the idea of caring for a small, whole life felt like a miracle she dared not hope for. So she had written. Her letter was as plain and honest as the advertisement. She stated her age, her past as a nurse, her good health, and her willingness to work hard and build a home. She didn't write of loneliness, of the long, silent nights in her small room back east, the feeling of being an observer of life rather than a participant. She didn't need to. A man like Silas Banning would understand that loneliness was the unspoken reason any woman would answer such an ad. His reply had been brief, written in a strong, clear hand. He acknowledged her letter, confirmed her suitability, and included a draft for her passage. He wrote that he would meet the stage when it arrived. The last sentence was as practical as the rest. The circuit judge passes through Dust Creek on the 1st of next month. It would be convenient to be wed then. There was no poetry in it, no romance. Mabel hadn't expected any. She was past the age of girlish dreams. What she wanted was a place to belong, a quiet harbor after a long and storm-tossed voyage. She wanted to hear the sound of a child's laughter. She wanted to put down roots in soil, no matter how dry and dusty, that she could call her own. "Almost there, ma'am," a voice rasped, breaking her reverie. It was Jebediah, the driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of every trail west of the Mississippi. He spoke without turning, his eyes fixed on the tired team of horses. "That there's Dust Creek." Mabel leaned forward, her heart giving a nervous leap. At first, she saw nothing but more of the same flat, sun-baked earth. Then, like a mirage hardening into reality, a collection of low, wooden structures appeared on the horizon. There was no gentle slope into civilization, no welcoming green trees. The town simply rose out of the dust, defiant and stark. A single main street, wide enough to turn a wagon team, was flanked by a dozen or so buildings, their unpainted wood weathered to the color of old bones. A saloon, a general store with a sagging porch, a livery stable, and, at the far end, the dark, open maw of a blacksmith's forge, a plume of gray smoke rising lazily into the vast, pale sky. The stagecoach slowed, its wheels crunching on the hard-packed dirt of the street. It rolled past the saloon, where the sound of a tinny piano and a burst of rough laughter spilled out into the afternoon heat. A few men on the porch stopped talking and turned to watch the coach, their eyes lingering with a flat, incurious gaze. Mabel saw the curtains of a nearby house twitch. In a town this small, an arrival was an event. With a final groan of wood and leather, the coach lurched to a halt in front of the general store. The door was swung open by the shotgun guard, a lanky youth who tipped his hat. "Dust Creek, ma'am." For a moment, Mabel remained seated, her hands clenched tightly on her reticule. This was it, the final step. She took a deep, steadying breath, the air thick with the smell of dust, horse, and the distant, metallic tang of the forge. She gathered her skirts and descended the steep steps, her worn boots making a soft thud on the ground. And then she stood there. The other passengers, a traveling salesman with a slick smile and a weary family of 4, were already being greeted. The salesman was clapped on the back by the store owner, while the family was enveloped by a group who rushed out from one of the small houses, a flurry of hugs and excited chatter. The noise and movement seemed to happen in a world apart from Mabel. She stood by her lone trunk, which Jebediah had unceremoniously dropped into the dust, and waited. She scanned the handful of people milling about. Her eyes searched for a man who might be Silas Banning. She imagined him to be broad-shouldered from his work, his face perhaps grim from loss, but with kind eyes. She looked for a man standing alone, a man with an air of expectation. She saw cowhands, their faces burned dark by the sun. She saw merchants and farmers. She saw old men chewing tobacco on a bench. None of them looked her way for more than a passing moment. No one stepped forward. The sun beat down on her bonneted head. A gust of wind, the town's ever-present greeter, swirled down the street, lifting a fine veil of grit that stung her eyes and coated her lips. She held her ground, her posture straight, her expression composed. She would not allow herself to look lost or frightened, even as a cold knot of apprehension began to tighten in her stomach. Perhaps he was delayed. A horse could have thrown a shoe, an urgent job at the forge. There were 100 sensible reasons. Jebediah finished watering the horses and climbed back onto his seat. "Well, ma'am," he said, his voice not unkind, "reckon your party's running late." "I expect so," she replied, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. He nodded, glancing around the street one last time as if to confirm the absence of her welcome. "There's a boarding house run by a widow, Millie Peterson, just down past the saloon. Clean beds. She keeps." He clucked to the horses, and with another groan, the stagecoach began to roll away. Mabel stood perfectly still and watched it go. She watched until it was just a dark shape shrinking against the horizon, until the dust it raised had settled back onto the street, leaving her utterly and completely alone. The happy sounds of the reunited family had faded as they disappeared into their home. The men on the saloon porch had gone back to their conversation. The town had absorbed its brief spectacle and returned to its business. She was left standing next to her trunk in the middle of a strange street in a strange town, with the setting sun casting her shadow long and solitary behind her. The advertisement had said he would meet her. The letter had confirmed it. But he wasn't here. A profound silence descended, broken only by the mournful whistle of the wind blowing through the eaves of the buildings. For the first time, Mabel felt the full weight of her 42 years. She had survived a war. She had faced down death itself. But she had never felt as vulnerable, as exposed, as she did in that moment. There was no enemy to fight, no wound to bind. There was only an immense, crushing quiet and the unspoken question that hung in the air. What now? She looked at her hands, the nurse's hands. They were empty. She looked up at the sky, a vast, indifferent canvas of deepening blue. Then, her gaze fell upon the blacksmith shop at the end of the street. The smoke still curled from its chimney. A life was going on in there, a life she had traveled 1,000 miles to join, drawing on a reserve of strength she didn't know she still possessed. Mabel straightened her shoulders. She would not crumble here, in the dust of a town that had not yet even learned her name. She had faced worse than being forgotten on a street corner, with deliberate, measured movements. She bent down and gripped the leather handle of her valise. The trunk would have to wait. One step, then another. She began to walk, her small, determined figure moving through the long shadows toward the boarding house, toward an unknown future, with no one to claim her. The walk to Millie Peterson's boarding house was no more than 100 yards, but it felt like a mile under the weight of unseen eyes. Every footfall in the thick dust seemed to echo in a great and profound stillness. The tinny piano music from the saloon had ceased, as if the player had decided the arrival of a solitary woman was a more compelling drama. Mabel kept her chin up and her gaze fixed on the 2-story building ahead, the only one in town with a painted sign that read, "Rooms and Victuals." Yet, from the corner of her eye, she was aware of the subtle shifts in the town's tableau. A woman who had been sweeping her porch suddenly stopped, her broom held motionless in her hands. The men on the bench outside the general store were no longer talking. They simply watched, their expressions unreadable. This was a different kind of silence from the one she had known in the war. That silence was the hollow space between cannon fire and screams, a silence of dread and reprieve. This was a silence of assessment. It picked at the threads of her worn dress, noted the sensible line of her bonnet, and measured the weary set of her shoulders. It was a language. And Mabel, a lifetime student of unspoken things, understood it perfectly. She was being weighed and found wanting. Mrs. Peterson was a small, bird-like woman with a cloud of white hair and eyes that missed nothing. She opened the door before Mabel had a chance to knock, wiping her hands on an apron that had seen better days. "Saw the stage come in," she said, her voice a little breathless. "You'll be wanting a room. I expect you look tired from your journey." There was a flicker of something in her eyes, curiosity, perhaps a little pity. "Just you." "Just me," Mabel confirmed, her voice even. "For a few nights, perhaps." She would not admit, not even to herself, that her plans were now a blank page. "Well, come in. Come in out of that wind, Mrs." Peterson bustled. "It's a caution, that wind never stops, dries a body out." The inside of the house was cool and dark, smelling of beeswax and baking bread. It was meticulously clean, a small oasis of order in the chaos of the frontier. As Mrs. Peterson led her up a narrow, creaking staircase, Mabel could hear the murmur of voices from a back parlor. The sound stopped abruptly as her footsteps sounded on the stairs. The silence flowed up from below, following her. The room was small, containing a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, and a single straight-backed chair. A window looked out over the main street, offering a clear view of the blacksmith's shop. "It's not much," the widow said, "but the bed is soft. Supper's at 6. You're welcome to join us." "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson. That's very kind," Mabel said, placing her valise on the chair. "I'll need to fetch my trunk from the street." No need to trouble yourself. Dear, I'll have my boy. Thomas, get it. You just rest a bit. The woman hesitated at the door, her head cocked. You're the one. For Silas Banning, she asked, her voice dropping to a near whisper. The question was direct, yet gentle. Mabel felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks. I believe he was delayed. Mrs. Peterson's lips tightened into a thin line of sympathy. Ah, yes, delayed. The word hung in the air, hollow and unconvincing. Well, you make yourself comfortable. She closed the door, and Mabel was finally alone. She walked to the window and stood, unmoving, looking out at the blacksmith's forge. The rhythmic clang of a hammer on an anvil began to ring out. A steady, powerful heartbeat in the town's quiet. Clang, clang, clang. That would be him, Silas Banning. He was there. He was working. He hadn't been called away to a sick neighbor or waylaid by a lame horse. He was simply there, in his shop, not 100 yards from where she had been set down in the dust, and he had not come. The cold knot in her stomach tightened into a fist of ice. She pressed a hand to her abdomen, taking a slow breath. There had to be a reason, a misunderstanding. Perhaps her letter with the arrival date had been lost. Perhaps he was a man so consumed by grief or work that social graces had been hammered out of him. She constructed these possibilities in her mind, building a fragile wall against the truth that the town's silence was screaming at her. Later, needing to buy a few small necessities, she made her way to the general store. The bell above the door announced her entry with a cheerful jingle that felt entirely out of place. The store owner, a portly man with a slicked-down comb-over, gave her a polite but distant nod. His wife, a woman with a face as sharp and unforgiving as a hawk's, was measuring out flour for another customer. 2 other women were present, lingering over a bolt of calico. Their conversation, which had been a low, pleasant hum, ceased the moment the bell rang. Mabel felt their eyes on her back as she moved toward the counter. She was intensely aware of her graying hair, of the travel dust that still clung to the hem of her dress. She knew, exactly what she was, a woman of mature years, a woman past her prime. She made her purchases: a bar of soap, a small comb, a length of ribbon to tie back her hair. As the store owner's wife wrapped her items in brown paper, her movements were stiff and deliberate. She did not meet Mabel's eyes. It was from the 2 women by the calico that the first whisper reached her ears, a sibilant hiss that cut through the silence. 40, if she's a day. Look at the gray in her hair. And him with little Eliza to think of. A man needs sons. What good is a barren wife? The words were not meant for her, yet they were aimed directly at her heart. They were the verbal confirmation of every cold stare, every twitching curtain. Barren. The word was a judgment, a final, damning verdict. In this world, a woman's worth was measured by her ability to fill a cradle. Her years as a nurse, the lives she had saved, the comfort she had given, none of that mattered here. She was a vessel, and they had judged her empty. Mabel's hands did not tremble as she accepted her package. Her expression did not change. She paid the exact amount, her coins clinking softly on the wooden counter. She had faced down cannonballs and disease. She would not be felled by the gossip of small-minded women. But as she turned to leave, her gaze inadvertently met that of the store owner's wife. In the woman's hard eyes, Mabel saw no malice, only a kind of pitying certainty. It was the look of someone stating an undeniable, if unfortunate, fact. She walked back to the boarding house, her head held high, but inside, the fragile wall of possibilities was crumbling. She still clung to a sliver of hope, a stubborn belief in the man who had written with such a firm, clear hand, the man who was a respected blacksmith, the man who needed a mother for his child. Surely that man would not be so cruel as to summon a woman across a continent only to abandon her on a dusty street because of the gray in her hair. All through supper, she maintained her composure. She sat at the long table with Mrs. Peterson, her son Thomas, and two other boarders, minors who ate with a silent, ravenous intensity. Mrs. Peterson tried to draw her into conversation, asking about her journey, about life back east. Mabel answered politely, her responses brief and noncommittal. She could feel the widow's unspoken questions, could feel her probing for the reason for Silas Banning's shocking breach of conduct. But Mabel offered no explanation, no complaint. She would give the town's gossips no more ammunition. She would keep her dignity, even if it was all she had left. After the meal, she retreated to her room. The sun had set, and a deep purple twilight was settling over the plains. The wind had died down, and the silence was now absolute. She lit the small oil lamp on her washstand, its yellow glow pushing back the encroaching shadows. The clang of the hammer had long since stopped. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, the bright clarity in her eyes now clouded with a deep, weary sorrow. The day had been a slow, painful stripping away of her hope. She had arrived in Dust Creek with a simple, modest dream, a home, a family, a purpose. Now, she felt like a fool, a desperate, aging spinster who had read too much into a few practical lines of ink on a page. And still, a tiny, resilient ember of hope refused to be extinguished. In the quiet of her room, in the heart of her disappointment, she waited for a miracle. It was no longer the grand hope of a welcoming embrace. It was smaller, more fragile now. She found herself listening for a footstep on the stairs, a heavy, masculine tread. She imagined a knock on her door. She pictured it opening to reveal a large man, his face smudged with soot, his eyes filled with apology. In her mind, she played out the scene. He would be there, filling the doorway, looking awkward and remorseful. "Mrs. Gable," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "I am Silas Banning. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. My apologies for not meeting the stage." She would stand, her heart pounding, and he would explain everything. And in the space of a few words, the cold stares and the cruel whispers would dissolve into nothing. The world would right itself. She would not be the old woman no one claimed. She would be his intended, the future Mrs. Banning, the mother for his child. She sat there for a long time, listening to the old house settle around her. She listened to the distant coyote yelps and the soft sigh of the night wind. But the heavy footstep on the stair never came. The knock on the door never sounded. The man did not appear. The only thing that came was the slow, painful realization that her miracle was not delayed. It simply wasn't coming. Sleep did not come easily. Mabel lay on the narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar groans and sighs of the boarding house as it settled in the cool night air. The patchwork quilt was soft, the room was clean, but peace was a distant country. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the wide, dusty street and the shrinking shape of the departing stagecoach. She heard the whispers of the women in the store, their words sharp as shards of glass. Barren. The word echoed in the silent room, a pronouncement of her failure not just as a potential wife, but as a woman. By the time the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, she had resolved herself to a new reality. Hope was a luxury, a flimsy thing that had been torn away. In its place was the cold, hard pragmatism that had seen her through the war. She would not wait for a man who did not want her. She would inquire about the next stagecoach. Whether it was heading east or west hardly mattered. She would find work. She was a skilled nurse, a competent seamstress, and a tolerable cook. She would survive. She always had. With this grim determination, she rose and dressed. When she came downstairs, the smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air. Millie Peterson was in the kitchen, a whirlwind of activity at a cast-iron stove. She looked up and offered a smile that was warmer than the morning sun. "Up already? Dear, I trust you slept well." It was a polite fiction, and both women knew it. "As well as can be expected. Thank you, Mrs. Peterson, Mabel replied, her voice quiet but firm. Is there anything I can do to help? Millie waved a spatula at her. Nonsense. You're a paying guest, but if you'd like to sit and keep an old woman company, you're more than welcome. Coffee's hot. Mabel accepted a thick ceramic mug of the dark, steaming liquid. She sat at the small kitchen table, its surface scrubbed white from years of labor. For a time, the only sounds were the sizzle of the bacon and the rhythmic ticking of a mantel clock in the parlor. It was Millie who finally broke the silence, her tone gentle. The stage doesn't come back through for another 3 days, she said, not looking at Mabel but concentrating on turning the bacon, headed west this time. It was a simple statement of fact, but it carried the weight of an answer to an unasked question. Mabel's plan to leave immediately was impossible. She was, for the moment, stranded in Dust Creek. A feeling of helplessness, an emotion she despised, washed over her. She gripped her mug, the warmth a small comfort against the chill that had settled deep inside her. I see, was all she said. Millie plated the bacon and then sat opposite her, her bird-like eyes full of a sympathy that was difficult to bear. It's a hard thing, dear, a cruel thing he's done. Perhaps he just changed his mind, Mabel offered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. It is his right. Changed his mind? Millie snorted, a surprisingly sharp sound from such a small woman. That's not Silas Banning's way. Stubborn as a mule and twice as predictable. If he says he'll do a thing, he does it. Or he did. Before, Mabel prompted. Her nurse's instinct for diagnosis peaked despite herself. The widow sighed, and it was as if a door had been opened. The stories, Mabel sensed, were about to come spilling out. Before Eleonora died, that's what changed him. And so, in the quiet of the morning kitchen, with the scent of coffee hanging in the air, the ghost of Silas Banning's past began to take shape. Millie spoke with the easy authority of one who has watched a life unfold from a ringside seat. She told of Silas arriving in Dust Creek a decade earlier. A young man then, strong and full of a quiet fire. He'd built the smithy with his own 2 hands, his hammer ringing out from dawn till dusk. He wasn't a great talker, never was, Millie recounted, her eyes focused on some distant memory. But he was good, honest in his work, fair in his prices, the kind of man you could build a town around. Then came Eleonora. She had been the daughter of a failed prospector, passing through with what was left of her family. Oh, she was a picture, Millie said, her voice softening. Hair like spun gold and eyes the color of a summer sky. Fragile, like a little porcelain doll. You could tell right off she wasn't made for this country. Too fine, too delicate. But Silas, he only had eyes for her. He looked at her like she was the sun and moon all rolled into one. They were married within 2 months. For 5 years, Millie said. The light in Silas Banning's life had burned brightly. The forge was still his work, but Eleonora was his world. He'd built her a small, sturdy house next to the smithy, planting a garden with the kinds of flowers she missed from back east. Her laughter, Millie recalled, was like the sound of little bells. But the land is hard on fragile things, the widow continued, her voice dropping, and Eleonora was the most fragile of all. The winters are bitter, the summers burn. She was never strong. After the little one came, she just faded. The little one, Eliza, Mabel's heart gave a strange, painful lurch. She was born 6 years ago, a tiny thing, but with her mother's eyes, Eleonora loved that child fiercely, but it took the last of her strength. A fever came on that winter, the kind that settles deep in the lungs. It took her in less than a week. Silas was like a man turned to stone. He sat by her bed, holding her hand, and never said a word. When it was over, he carried her out and buried her himself up on the little hill behind their house. Millie paused, taking a sip of her now cool coffee. A part of him was buried with her that day, the part that knew how to smile. He threw himself into his work, hammering from sunup to sundown as if he could beat the grief out of the iron. He raised that little girl. Of course, he's a good father. Don't mistake me. He provides for her, keeps her safe, but the warmth, it's gone. He's a house with no master, a hearth with no fire. The image was so vivid, so desolate, that Mabel felt a pang of profound empathy for this man she had never met. Her own disappointment seemed small and selfish in the face of such a cavernous loss. "So when we heard he'd put that notice in the paper," Millie went on, leaning forward, "the whole town was surprised, pleased. Mind you, we all said it was for the best, for little Eliza's sake. A child needs a mother's touch. We thought, well, he's finally ready to let the light back in. He's finally ready to live again." She sat back, her hands flat on the table. "And then you came, and he wasn't there." The silence in the kitchen stretched, filled with the enormity of it all. The story explained the man, his grief, his solitude, but it didn't explain his cruelty. "But there's more, dear," Millie said, her voice now barely a whisper, her eyes wide. "It's not just you he didn't meet." Mabel waited, a sense of dread prickling her skin. "He hasn't been seen in town, not proper seen, for near on a month. He's in his forge. We can all hear the hammer, and we see him go back to the house at night, but he doesn't speak. He doesn't stop at the store. And Mr. Abernathy, the postmaster, told me just yesterday, Silas hasn't collected his mail in 3 weeks. There's a stack of letters for him, just sitting there, your letters among them. I'd wager." The revelation struck Mabel with the force of a physical blow. It changed everything. This wasn't a deliberate, personal rejection. This wasn't a man who had seen her and found her too old, too plain. This was a man who had likely never even seen her letters. A man who had put a notice in a paper during a brief moment of hope, and then had retreated so far back into his shell of grief that the outside world, with its mail and its stagecoaches and its arriving brides, had ceased to exist for him. He was a house with no master. He was there, but he wasn't. The cruelty she had imagined was not cruelty at all. It was a profound and troubling absence, a sickness of the soul. The nurse in her, the part that had been dormant since the war, began to stir. She had seen men like that before. Men who had lost a limb and yet still felt the phantom ache. Men who had survived the battle only to be consumed by the ghosts of the fallen. They called it soldier's heart, a deep melancholy that could hollow a man out from the inside. Silas Banning was a casualty of a different kind of war, but the wound was just as deep. "He is unwell," Mabel said, the words coming out as a diagnosis rather than a question. Millie nodded slowly. That's the long and short of it. Trapped in that house with the memory of her, and hammering all day long to keep from hearing the silence. Mabel stood up and walked to the small parlor window that faced the street, down the way. The plume of smoke was already rising from the forge's chimney. Soon, the hammering would begin. The lonely, desperate rhythm of a man at war with his own past. She was no longer a jilted mail-order bride. She was a nurse who had stumbled upon a patient who didn't know he was sick, and a small, motherless child caught in the shadow of his pain. The thought of leaving on the stagecoach in 3 days' time now seemed like a dereliction of duty. To turn her back on this hidden suffering felt wrong, a betrayal of the very core of her being. She did not know what she could do. She did not know if she would even be welcome. But she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she could not simply walk away. The mystery of Silas Banning was no longer about her own future. It was about his. The 3 days that followed Mabel's conversation with Millie were a study in quiet observation. The knowledge that Silas Banning's absence was a symptom of a deeper wound, rather than a personal slight, had fundamentally altered her position. She was no longer a woman waiting to be claimed or rejected. She was a nurse on the edge of a case, assessing a situation before she could determine a course of action. She spent her time in purposeful quiet, helping Millie with the day's chores, mending linens in the afternoon, and taking long, solitary walks in the late afternoon when the heat of the day began to break. These walks were her reconnaissance. She learned the town's rhythms, the way the shadows of the false-fronted buildings stretched across the dusty street, the times when the saloon was loudest, and the times when a profound hush fell over everything. She never walked directly past the blacksmith's forge. Instead, she kept her distance, observing it as one might observe a slumbering bear. The clang of the hammer was a constant, a sound that she began to dissect. There was a fury in it, a relentless, punishing rhythm that spoke not of creation, but of a desperate need to obliterate thought. It was the sound of a man drowning out the ghosts in his own head. On the third afternoon, her walk took her beyond the edge of town, where the hard-packed dirt of the main street gave way to sparse, dry grass, and the land began to swell into low, rolling hills, a small, meandering creek, little more than a trickle in the late summer heat, had carved a shallow path through the landscape, and along its banks grew a line of cottonwoods and a single, magnificent oak. Its branches, thick and gnarled with age, spread wide, offering a deep pool of shade that was a welcome respite from the unrelenting sun. Drawn to the quiet and the cool, Mabel made her way toward the tree. The air here was different, softer, filled with the hum of insects and the gentle rustle of leaves. It was a place of peace. As she drew closer, she heard another sound, a soft, melodic humming, a child's tune without words. She stopped. There, in the dappled light beneath the great oak, a little girl was playing. She was on her knees in the dirt, entirely absorbed in her own small world. Mabel's first impression was one of fragility. The child was small for her age, with a tangle of dark hair that had escaped its braids and a simple calico dress that was clean but noticeably patched at the elbow. She was alone, but she did not seem lonely. Her focus was absolute. She was arranging a collection of smooth, gray stones into the shape of a house, with twigs for walls and a large, flat rock for a door. A corn-husk doll, its yarn hair unraveling, sat propped against the base of the tree, the silent mistress of this miniature homestead. This had to be Eliza. Mabel felt her heart constrict. This was the child Millie had spoken of, the little girl whose mother had faded like a summer flower and whose father had retreated behind a wall of grief and iron. She watched for a long moment, unseen, her nurse's instincts taking over. The child was thin, but not unwell. Her concentration was a sign of a healthy, imaginative mind. But the solitude, it was the profound, self-contained solitude of a child long accustomed to being on her own. Not wanting to startle her, Mabel took a slow, deliberate step forward, making sure to snap a twig under her boot. The humming stopped. The girl's head came up, and for the first time, Mabel saw her face. It was a heart-stoppingly lovely face, with the delicate, fine-boned features of the porcelain doll Millie had described. But it was her eyes that held Mabel captive. They were a startling, luminous blue, the color of a deep summer sky just after a rainstorm. They were not a child's eyes. They were ancient, filled with a strange, unnerving clarity, a knowingness that seemed far beyond her 6 years. They looked at Mabel without shyness, without fear, but with a calm, steady gaze of assessment. Mabel offered a small, gentle smile. "Hello," she said, her voice soft. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." The girl did not answer immediately. She simply looked, her blue eyes seeming to take in every detail of Mabel's face, from the lines around her eyes to the silver strands at her temples. Then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "That is a very fine house you are building," Mabel said, taking another slow step closer and gesturing toward the arrangement of stones. "Your doll must be very proud of it." "It's not for the doll," the child said. Her voice was as clear and soft as her humming. "It's for my mama. When she comes back." The innocent words struck Mabel with a quiet, devastating force. This child was not just waiting for a mother. She was waiting for her mother. the one with hair like spun gold who now slept on the hill behind the house. A fresh wave of empathy washed over Mabel, so strong it almost buckled her knees. "I see," Mabel said, her voice a little thick. "It's a beautiful house. She will love it." She lowered herself to the ground, a respectable distance away, moving with the slow, non-threatening grace she had learned in the hospital wards. She tucked her skirts around her ankles and waited. She would not press. She would let the child lead. Eliza went back to her stones, placing a small, white pebble by the rock door. "For the step," she explained matter-of-factly. She worked in silence for another minute, seemingly unaware of Mabel's presence. And then, without looking up, she spoke again, her voice calm and even. "Are you the one?" Mabel blinked. The one. Now the girl looked up, her blue gaze pinning Mabel to the spot. The intensity was startling. "The one who's come to be my father's wife." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The air grew still. The humming of the insects faded away. Mabel's carefully constructed composure, the pragmatic armor she had worn for days, shattered into 1,000 pieces. The question was not a guess. It was not a childish flight of fancy. It was delivered with the simple, unshakable certainty of a person stating a known fact, like the sky is blue or the sun is hot. Mabel opened her mouth, but no sound came out. How could she possibly know no one in town knew the full story except Millie, who would never have spoken of it to a child? Her father was a recluse who hadn't even opened her letters. It was impossible. Yet the certainty in those sky-blue eyes was undeniable. How did you know to ask that?" Mabel finally managed, her voice a hoarse whisper. Eliza tilted her head, as if the question were a strange one. "I just knew," she said simply. "I've been waiting for you." "I've been waiting for you." The words, so simple, so pure, accomplished what the town's scorn and Silas's absence could not. They broke through the last of Mabel's defenses. A hot sting of tears pricked at the back of her eyes, the first she had allowed herself since her arrival. For days, she had been an object of speculation, a problem, a disappointment. She had been invisible, unseen. But this child, this lonely, motherless girl, saw her. She had not only seen her, she had been waiting for her. She swallowed hard, forcing the tears back. She would not cry in front of this strange, wise child. She owed her the truth. "I came to Dust Creek," Mabel began, her voice gaining strength, "with the hope of meeting your father." "Yes." Eliza considered this. She did not smile or clap her hands as another child might have. She simply gave another one of her solemn, knowing nods. It was a confirmation. "He works too much," she stated. "The hammer is too loud. It makes him forget things." It was the most astute diagnosis Mabel had yet heard, out of the mouths of babes. This child understood her father's condition better than anyone. He hammered to forget, and in his forgetting, he had forgotten her. "Men who are in pain sometimes do that," Mabel said softly. "They build walls to keep the hurt from getting out. But sometimes, the walls are so thick they keep good things from getting in, too." Eliza seemed to ponder this, her small brow furrowed in concentration. She picked up her corn-husk doll and held it in her lap, stroking its yarn hair. When she looked up again, her expression was one of serious, adult-like purpose. "Will you come home now?" she asked. Mabel's breath caught in her throat. Come home. To the house next to the forge. The house built for the woman with hair like spun gold. To the man who hammered to forget. The man who didn't even know she existed. It was a terrifying, impossible proposition. It was an invitation into the very heart of the town's central mystery, its deepest sorrow. Logic, reason, and self-preservation screamed at her to say no, to explain to this child that it wasn't so simple, that her father had to be the one to ask. But looking into those impossibly old eyes, Mabel knew that logic had no place here. This was a matter of faith. For days she had been adrift, her purpose lost. Now, a small hand was reaching out from the shore. slowly, as if in a dream. Eliza stood up. She walked the few steps to where Mabel sat and, without any hesitation, placed her small, dusty hand into Mabel's. The contact was electric, a current of pure, unconditional trust. It was a claiming, in the face of the town's rejection, in the void of her father's silence. This child had claimed her. Mabel looked down at the small hand resting in her own. Her hands, which had tended to the broken and the dying, now held this small, fragile, living hope. Her journey to Dust Creek had not been a fool's errand after all. She had come seeking a husband, a home. She had found something far more elemental. She had found a reason. "Yes," Mabel heard herself say, her voice full of a conviction that surprised her. "Yes, I will." The world narrowed to the feeling of the child's small, trusting hand in her own. Each of Eliza's steps was a firm, purposeful pull, leading Mabel away from the quiet sanctuary of the oak tree and toward the loud, fiery heart of the town's mystery. The walk was short, but with every yard they closed on the blacksmith's shop, Mabel's own heart beat a little faster, a nervous counterpoint to the steady, rhythmic clang of the hammer that grew louder and louder. They passed the house first, set back a little from the street. It was a well-built structure of solid timber, but it wore an air of profound neglect. A garden bed, once lovingly laid out, was choked with weeds, the withered stalks of last year's flowers rattling in the breeze like dry bones. The windows were grimy, staring out like clouded, unseeing eyes. It was a house that was no longer a home, but merely a shelter, a place where a man and a child slept and ate without joy. It was a physical manifestation of the grief Millie had described. The forge itself was a different entity entirely. It was brutally alive. It was a cavernous, open-fronted structure of blackened wood and stone, breathing smoke and heat into the afternoon air. The relentless, punishing sound of the hammer on steel was the sound of a battle, a furious, one-man war against an unseen enemy. As they approached, the force of each blow was a physical impact, a concussion in the air that Mabel felt deep in her chest. Sparks flew from the doorway, a shower of angry, golden insects. Eliza did not hesitate. She led Mabel right to the edge of the deep shadow cast by the forge's roof, her small hand still holding fast. And then she let go. She took 2 steps into the cavernous space, a tiny, fearless figure against the backdrop of fire and flying sparks. "Papa!" she called out, her child's voice cutting through the din with astonishing clarity. The hammer, raised high for another blow, froze in midair. For a heartbeat, the man holding it remained a silhouette against the glowing heart of the forge, a giant forged from shadow and light. Then he lowered the hammer, placing it beside the anvil with a dull, metallic thud. The sudden, absolute silence was more shocking than the noise had been. It rang in Mabel's ears, a hollow, vibrating void. He turned, and for the first time, Mabel saw him. Silas Banning was a man built on a scale to match his work. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with powerful arms corded with muscle, slick with sweat and streaked with soot. His face, grim and angular, was cast in shadow, his jaw tight, his mouth a hard, straight line. He wore a heavy leather apron over a sweat-dampened shirt, but it was his eyes that captured her. They were a deep, stormy gray, and they were utterly exhausted. It was the bone-deep weariness of a man who had not known a single moment of peace for a very long time. He was a veteran, Mabel remembered Millie saying, and she saw it now. He had the look of a man who had stared into the abyss, both on the battlefield and in his own home, and had never quite looked away. His gaze fell first on his daughter, and for a fleeting instant, the hard lines of his face softened with a flicker of something protective, something paternal. Then his eyes moved, shifting to the woman who stood just outside the circle of his world, and they turned to stone. He looked at Mabel not with anger or surprise, but with a flat, cold indifference that was far more chilling. He looked at her as if she were a stray dog that had wandered onto his property, a nuisance to be dealt with and dismissed. "Papa, I brought her," Eliza said, her voice filled with a simple, presentational pride. "She's the one." Silas's jaw tightened. He wiped a hand across his sweaty brow, leaving a black smudge. He did not look at Mabel. He looked past her, at the dusty street, at the indifferent sky, at anywhere but at the woman his daughter had brought to his door. "I haven't decided to marry anyone," he said. The words were rough, rusty, as if pulled from a part of him long unused. They were not directed at Mabel, or even at his daughter. They were a proclamation to the world at large, a statement of fact meant to end any and all discussion. He was a man posting a no trespassing sign on the borders of his life. The rejection was absolute, as cold and hard as the anvil beside him. Mabel felt the eyes of the town on her back, even from this distance. She could imagine the satisfied nods of the women in the general store. "See, we told you so." The heat of humiliation, which had cooled to a dull ember, flared once more in her cheeks. The old Mabel, the one who had stepped off the stagecoach, would have turned and walked away, her dignity her only shield. But she was not that woman anymore. She had been claimed by the child who now stood looking up at her father, her expression not of disappointment, but of patient confusion, as if he were a student who had simply failed to grasp a simple lesson. Mabel looked from the father's bleak, guarded face to the daughter's open, knowing one. She was not here for the man, not yet. She was here for the child. She took a breath, marshalling the calm authority she had learned in the face of dying, terrified men. She would not address his statement about marriage. She would not acknowledge the personal nature of his dismissal. She would reframe the entire encounter. "Mr. Banning," she said, her voice clear and steady, surprising even herself with its lack of tremor. "My name is Mabel Gable. I have indeed traveled a long way in response to your advertisement. It seems there has been a misunderstanding, for which no one is at fault." He still would not look at her, but she saw a muscle twitch in his jaw. She had his attention. "My journey here was paid for by the draft you sent," she continued, her tone practical and businesslike, "and I find myself in your town with no immediate means of returning. I am not a woman who accepts charity, Mr. Banning. A debt has been incurred, and I feel it is my responsibility to repay it." She paused, letting the words settle in the ringing silence. Now, finally, he shifted his gaze, his stormy gray eyes meeting hers for the first time. The weariness in them was profound, but there was a flicker of something else, too, a wary, guarded intelligence. He was listening. "Your daughter is a lovely child," Mabel said, her voice softening as she glanced at Eliza. "But it is clear that the running of a household and the care of a young girl is a great deal of work for a man who already works as hard as you do. Therefore, I would like to make a proposal. Allow me to stay for a few days, 3 days, perhaps, until the next stagecoach arrives. In that time, I will look after Eliza and see to your household. I am a capable cook and housekeeper. My labor will serve as payment for my passage. After 3 days, the debt will be settled, and I will be on my way. You will have lost nothing on a wasted journey, and I will leave with my accounts squared." It was, she thought, the finest speech of her life. It was honest, practical, and offered him a way to accept her presence without conceding an inch. It was not about marriage, or loneliness, or his grief. It was a simple business transaction, a debt to be repaid. She had taken his cold, hard world and spoken to him in its own language. Silas stared at her, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He looked from Mabel's calm, determined face to his daughter's hopeful one. Eliza had moved to stand beside Mabel, a small, silent vote of confidence. He looked past them, toward the house, toward the weed-choked garden. Mabel could almost see the war being waged behind his eyes. Every instinct, every raw nerve screaming at him to refuse, to send her away, to be left alone in the ordered misery he had created for himself. But then there was the child, and there was the undeniable logic of her proposal. He turned his back on them without a word, picking up a piece of iron with a pair of tongs and thrusting it into the glowing coals of the forge. For a moment, Mabel thought he was going to start hammering again, to simply ignore them until they went away. The fire roared, hissing as he worked the bellows. He stared into the flames, his broad back a wall of rejection. Then his shoulders slumped in a barely perceptible sigh of defeat. 3 days, he said, his back still to them, the words rough and grudging. The house is unlocked. It was not a welcome. It was a surrender. Mabel felt a wave of relief so profound she felt lightheaded. She had won. Not a victory of the heart, but a strategic foothold. "Thank you, Mr. Banning," she said simply. He did not reply. She felt a tug on her hand and looked down. Eliza was smiling, a small, radiant smile that transformed her serious little face. It was the first time Mabel had seen her smile, and it was like the sun breaking through the clouds. Holding the child's hand, Mabel turned away from the forge and the man who was its prisoner. She walked toward the house with the clouded windows and the dead garden. As Eliza pushed the unlocked door open, a wave of cool, stale air washed over them, carrying the faint, ghostly scent of lavender and dust. Mabel stepped across the threshold. The inside was dark, the curtains drawn. It was a man's space now, stripped of all softness. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw the faint outlines of the life that had been. A piece of fine needlework lay folded in a basket by a chair, a needle still threaded through the fabric as if its owner had just set it down for a moment. On a small table, a faded blue ribbon was tucked into a book of poetry. The ghost of Eleonora was here, in the dust motes dancing in the thin shafts of light. This was her house. Mabel was an intruder, a stranger stepping into the heart of a shrine. She had been granted 3 days inside these walls, 3 days to see if she could convince the house and its master to live again. The first of the 3 days began not with a conversation, but with an action. Mabel rose before the sun, her internal clock wound tight by years of early rising in hospital wards. The house was cold, steeped in a profound, pre-dawn stillness. She moved quietly, her footsteps soft on the wooden floorboards, and went first to the windows in the main room. They were covered in a film of grime, and the heavy curtains, thick with the dust of years, were drawn tight, holding the darkness of the night captive long after it had fled the outside world. With a firm, decisive movement, she pulled the curtains back. The fabric was stiff and reluctant. Then she unlatched the window and pushed it open. A clean, cool breeze, carrying the scent of dry earth and the distant promise of the sun, flowed into the stale air of the room. It was a transfusion, an offering of life to a space that had been holding its breath for too long. She did the same in the kitchen, letting the morning light spill across the dusty surfaces and glint off the tarnished cutlery. Light and air. These were the first medicines for any sickness. The kitchen was her sanctuary and her battlefield. It was a space built for a woman who loved to cook, with a good stove and ample counter space. But it had fallen into a state of masculine neglect. A half-empty sack of flour sat on the counter, a bag of dried beans, a tin of coffee, some salt pork wrapped in butcher's paper. It was the food of lonely survival, not of a home. Mabel found a small store of root vegetables in the cellar and, in a dusty corner, a sourdough starter, dormant but not yet dead. It was a small, living remnant of Eleonora, of the life that had been, with a practiced hand. Mabel fed it, coaxing it back to life. It was a resurrection in miniature. All morning, she worked. She scrubbed the floors, washed the windows, and coaxed a warm, fragrant life from the cold hearth of the stove. The house began to change. The smell of dust and sorrow was slowly replaced by the scent of baking bread, of soap and water, of a simmering pot of stew. Eliza was her silent, watchful apprentice. The child sat at the kitchen table, her chin cupped in her hands, her sky-blue eyes tracking Mabel's every movement. She did not ask questions. She simply observed, absorbing the quiet, purposeful energy that Mabel had brought into the house. At midday, the clang of the hammer in the forge ceased. A few minutes later, Silas Banning stood at the kitchen door, filling the frame. He was clean, having washed at the pump outside, but his face was still a mask of grim exhaustion. He looked around the transformed kitchen, his eyes taking in the clean surfaces, the light streaming through the window, the pot bubbling on the stove. He said nothing. His expression did not change, but Mabel, a student of the smallest human signals, saw the almost imperceptible widening of his eyes, the slight shift in his posture. He had noticed. He sat at the head of the table, the place he always sat, and Mabel served him a bowl of the thick beef and vegetable stew, along with a thick slice of the fresh bread. She placed it before him without a word, and then served Eliza and herself. They ate in complete silence, a silence so thick it felt like a fourth presence at the table. It was not the companionable silence of a family comfortable with one another, but the tense, guarded silence of strangers forced into an unwelcome intimacy. Silas ate with a focused intensity, his gaze fixed on his bowl. He did not look at her. He did not speak. But when he was finished, the bowl was empty. He had taken the nourishment she had offered. It was a start. The second day, she turned her attention to the mending. In a corner of the main room sat a large wicker basket, overflowing with clothes in need of repair. Eliza's small dresses had torn hems and missing buttons. Silas's work shirts were frayed at the cuffs, the seams under the arms giving way from the strain of his labor. It was a testament to a life unraveling at the edges. Mabel sat in a rocking chair by the newly cleaned window, the afternoon light falling on her work. She took up a small, patched dress first, her needle moving with a quick, practiced rhythm. Each stitch was an act of restoration, a small knot of care tied against the encroaching chaos. Eliza brought over a tattered picture book and sat on the floor at Mabel's feet. "Mama used to read this to me," she said, her voice soft. "Would you like me to read it now?" Mabel asked. Eliza nodded, her eyes bright, as Mabel's voice filled the quiet room, weaving a simple tale of a talking bear and a clever fox. She felt the child lean against her knees. It was a small, unconscious gesture of trust, and it warmed Mabel more than the afternoon sun. Later, she began to teach the child her letters, scratching them with a piece of charcoal onto a smooth piece of kindling. Eliza was a quick study, her mind bright and thirsty. They were in the middle of forming AB when the shadow of Silas fell across them. He had come in from the forge for a drink of water and had stopped in the doorway, watching them. Mabel's hand froze mid-letter. She looked up, her heart suddenly racing. His face was unreadable in the gloom of the house, but he did not move. He simply stood there, watching the impromptu lesson, a silent, looming presence. Eliza, unaware, pointed a small, grubby finger at the charcoal letter. "B," she said proudly, "for Banning." Silas turned without a word and went back out to the forge, but Mabel knew, with absolute certainty, that he had seen. He had seen his daughter learning, had seen a moment of quiet, domestic peace in his house of ghosts. He had not acknowledged it, but he had borne witness to it. On the morning of the third day, Mabel realized they were out of flour. The trip to the general store was unavoidable. She tidied Eliza's hair, tied a fresh ribbon at the end of her braids, and took the child's hand. Walking down the main street of Dust Creek with Eliza Banning at her side was like walking onto a stage. Conversations on the saloon porch halted. The curtains in the houses twitched. This time, however, Mabel was not alone. She had a small, fierce ally whose hand was clasped tightly in her own. Inside the store, the atmosphere was thick with a chilly, disapproving curiosity. Mrs. Gable, the store owner's wife, stood behind the counter like a hawk on a perch. "Good morning, Eliza," she said, her voice dripping with a false sweetness that did not reach her hard eyes. She ignored Mabel completely. "Is your papa letting you run wild now?" "I am not running wild," Eliza replied, her voice steady. "My mother is taking me to buy flour for our bread." The silence in the store was instantaneous and absolute. Mrs. Gable's thin lips disappeared into a tight, bloodless line. Another woman, who had been examining a display of canned peaches, gasped softly. They looked at Mabel, then at the child, their expressions a mixture of shock and pity. The poor, motherless child, they were clearly thinking, her mind has become fanciful with grief. "Now, Eliza, Mrs. Gable began, her tone condescendingly gentle. "You know your dear mother is in heaven with the angels." "I know," Eliza said, her blue eyes fixed on the woman with an unnerving calm. She then turned her gaze to Mabel, and in a clear, ringing voice that every person in the store could hear, she said, "This is my new mother. The grown-ups just don't believe it yet." Mabel paid for the flour, her hands steady, her back straight. She did not look at the stunned faces of the women. She simply took her package, took Eliza's hand once more, and walked out of the store, leaving a wake of shattered silence behind her. The afternoon of the third day waned. Mabel prepared the evening meal, her movements slow and deliberate. Her time was up. She had scrubbed, cooked, and mended. She had paid her debt. The house was clean. A hearty beef pie was cooling on the counter. A stack of neatly mended clothes sat in the wicker basket. She had brought a fragile, temporary order to the chaos. After she had tucked Eliza into her small bed, reading her a final story, Mabel went to her own room. She took out her valise and began to pack her few belongings, her spare dress, her brush and comb, her Bible. There was a deep ache in her chest, a sorrow more profound than the one she had felt upon her arrival. Then, it had been the death of a hope. Now, it was the pain of leaving a place where she had, against all odds, begun to feel she belonged. She brought the valise downstairs and placed it by the front door. She did not want there to be any misunderstanding. She was a woman of her word. She had been granted 3 days, and the third day was ending. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap. When Silas came in, he stopped at the door, his large frame filling the space, and his gaze went from the neatly set table to the cooling pie, and then to the packed valise by the door. He looked at it for a long, silent moment. The mantel clock in the parlor ticked loudly, measuring out the seconds of her remaining time. Mabel stood up. "Mr. Banning," she began, her voice even, "supper is ready. I trust our arrangement is concluded to your satisfaction. The stagecoach arrives tomorrow at noon." He held up a hand, a gesture that was not a request but a command for silence. He walked past her, his boots heavy on the clean floor, and went to the wash basin. He washed his hands and face, the splashing water the only sound. Then he dried himself on a fresh towel she had laid out, and sat down at his place at the head of the table. He looked at the empty plate in front of him. Then he looked at her, his stormy gray eyes holding hers for the first time without a wall between them. The exhaustion was still there, the deep, abiding grief. But there was something else, too, a flicker of something that might have been desperation, or perhaps just a profound reluctance to be alone again. He did not speak. He did not say, "Stay." He simply gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod toward the empty chair opposite him. It was not an invitation. It was an expectation. It was a silent acknowledgement that this was her place now, and that the valise by the door was an unwelcome intrusion. The unnamed days were over, but the new ones had not yet been given a name. She was not a bride. She was not a housekeeper. She was simply there. And for now, that was enough. The valise, once unpacked, was not put away. Mabel slid it under the narrow bed in her room, a silent acknowledgement of the temporary nature of her existence in this house. The 3 days had come and gone, and she was still here. No new arrangement had been discussed. No words had been spoken about the future. She had simply stayed. Her presence was a fact, like the rising of the sun or the relentless wind, accepted but not yet embraced. A new, unspoken rhythm established itself. It was a life lived in the quiet spaces between the clang of the hammer. Mabel would rise, open the house to the morning, and prepare breakfast. Silas would enter, eat in his customary silence, and leave. Eliza, who had become Mabel's shadow, would spend the day with her, learning her letters, helping to knead bread, or listening to stories read in a calm, steady voice. At midday and again at dusk, the silent meal was repeated. It was a life of shared space, not of shared intimacy. Yet there were changes, small as the shifting of dust motes in a sunbeam. One evening, Silas spoke. "The stew is good," he said, his voice rough. It was not praise so much as a gruff statement of fact, but it was a crack in the wall of his silence. Another day. Mabel found a bucket of freshly pumped water waiting for her by the kitchen door when she awoke, a task he had silently taken upon himself. He began to look at her, not with the warmth of affection, but with a flicker of something, acknowledgement, perhaps. He saw her, not just as a presence, but as a person who was methodically, quietly, bringing his dead house back to life. For Mabel, these small concessions were enough. She had no illusions about romance. She was tending to a family, just as she had once tended to a ward of broken soldiers. The work was its own reward. Seeing the smudge of flour on Eliza's happy face, seeing the worn-out look in Silas's eyes recede, even by a fraction, this was a purpose she could understand. She began to feel the fragile roots of belonging begin to tentatively push their way into the hard, dry soil of this place. But roots, she knew, could not grow in a constant wind, and in Dust Creek, the wind of gossip was always blowing. It began, as it always did, in the general store. When Mabel went for supplies, the conversations would stop, replaced by a charged silence and the piercing stares of the town's women. They saw a woman with graying hair presiding over Silas Banning's home, a child at her side calling her mother, and they made their own calculations. Their whispers were sharp and cold, meant to be overheard. "It's a shame, is what it is," she heard one woman murmur to another over a barrel of pickles. "A man like Silas needs sons to carry on the forge. He needs a strong heir." "And what is she going to give him?" the other replied, her voice laced with a pity that was more venomous than scorn. "She's a walking drought. Her childbearing years are a decade gone. If not more, it's unnatural." The words were like stones thrown from a safe distance. Mabel pretended not to hear. She kept her back straight, her expression placid, and her voice even as she asked Mrs. Gable for a pound of coffee. But the words found their mark. A walking drought. The phrase burrowed into her mind, a seed of doubt planted in the fragile soil of her newfound peace. She had been so focused on the immediate needs of the house, of the child, of the broken man, that she had not considered the future in those terms. Sons, heirs, that was the currency of this world, the measure of a wife's true worth. It was a currency she did not possess. The whispers grew into a steady chorus. She felt it in the way women would pull their children a little closer when she and Eliza passed. She saw it in the tight, disapproving smiles that never reached their eyes. They had judged her and found her insufficient. She was not a solution to Silas's problem. She was a placeholder, a temporary arrangement that defied the natural order of things. The town's judgment soon found a champion. Her name was Clara Mae Thompson, the 19-year-old daughter of a local rancher who had come into a bit of money. Clara Mae was everything Mabel was not. She was a riot of youthful color and vitality. Her hair was the color of honey, her cheeks bloomed with a rosy health, and her laughter was loud and frequent. She moved with the easy, unthinking confidence of a young woman who had always been admired, who knew her value and was not afraid to display it. Mabel saw her for the first time one afternoon from the window of the house. Clara May was walking down the street, dressed in a bright yellow dress that stood out against the drab, dusty landscape like a defiant wildflower. Several of the town's matrons, including Mrs. Gable, flanked her like ladies-in-waiting. They stopped near the forge, and their conversation, carried on the wind, was a performance for the whole town to see. Clara May's appearance was the catalyst the town had been waiting for. She was the obvious, the correct choice for Silas Banning. She was young, she was healthy, she was from a respected family, and most importantly, her youth was a guarantee of fertility. She could give Silas the sons he needed, the future he deserved. Mabel, in her plain gray dress, with her quiet ways and her silvering hair, was a ghost of the past. Clara May was the vibrant, undeniable promise of the future. The pressure, which had been a thing of whispers and cold stares, now took a more direct form. A few days later, Mabel was in the small yard behind the house, hanging laundry on a line she had mended. When she saw Clara May approaching, the younger woman was carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. She did not walk to the house. She walked directly to the wide, open mouth of the forge. Mabel's hands stilled on the line. She felt a cold dread creep into her stomach. She was hidden from the street by the corner of the house, an unseen observer. Clara May stopped at the edge of the forge, just as Mabel had done weeks before. "Mr. Banning," she called out, her voice as sweet and clear as honey. The hammering stopped. Silas emerged from the shadows, wiping his face with a rag. He looked tired, but his posture straightened slightly when he saw his visitor. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice a low rumble of surprise. "I do hope I'm not disturbing you from your work," Clara May said, flashing a brilliant smile. "But my mother baked an apple pie this morning, and we all know a man works better with a full belly. We thought you and your sweet Eliza might enjoy it." She held out the basket. It was a calculated public gesture. A pie was not just a pie. It was a symbol of domesticity, of a woman's care, a traditional offering of courtship. It was a direct challenge to the woman who was currently running Silas's kitchen. It was an invasion. Silas looked from the offered pie to Clara May's pretty, expectant face. He looked trapped. To refuse would be a public insult to the daughter of a prominent rancher. It would be a breach of the unspoken social code of the West. He was a man who valued his solitude. But he was not an outcast. He still had to live in this town. Mabel held her breath. She willed him to say no, to say that his household was well provided for. She willed him to make a stand, to draw a line in the dust and declare his loyalty to the quiet, fragile peace they had built. But Silas was a man of few words and fewer social graces. He was cornered. After a moment of hesitation that felt like an eternity, he reached out a large, soot-stained hand and took the basket. "My thanks to your mother, Miss Thompson," he said, his voice flat and noncommittal. "It's no trouble at all," Clara May chirped, her smile widening in victory. "You work far too hard, Mr. Banning. A man shouldn't have to carry all his burdens alone." With a final, meaningful glance, she turned and walked away, her yellow dress a triumphant banner in the afternoon sun. Silas stood there for a long moment, holding the basket. He looked down at it as if it were a foreign object he didn't know what to do with. Then, with a heavy sigh, he carried it inside the forge and set it on a workbench. The hammering did not resume for a long time. Mabel felt as if all the air had been punched from her lungs. It was not jealousy she felt, not in the way a young lover would feel it. It was a deeper, more profound ache. It was the feeling of being erased. She had spent weeks creating order, providing nourishment, and earning a small, silent place for herself. And in a single, public moment, her position had been rendered invalid. The town had presented its candidate, and Silas, by accepting the pie, had accepted the premise of the argument that he was a man in need of a wife, and that she, Mabel, was not the one to fill that role. She finished hanging the laundry, her movements stiff and automatic. She went back into the quiet house. It no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like borrowed space, a room she'd been allowed to occupy on borrowed time. She looked at the needlework basket that had belonged to Eleonora, the book of poetry on the table. She had respected these ghosts, had lived alongside them. But Clara May would not. A young bride would sweep away all traces of the past, as was her right. She would fill the house with her own things, her own laughter, her own children. That evening, the apple pie sat in the center of the dinner table. Silas had brought it in from the forge, a silent, unavoidable fact. It smelled of cinnamon and sugar, the scent of a proper home. Mabel served the beef stew she had made, but its hearty aroma was overwhelmed. Silas cut a piece for Eliza, and then one for himself. He did not offer any to Mabel. They ate in their usual silence. But tonight it was different. It was the silence of an ending. After she had cleaned the last dish, after the house was still and Eliza was asleep, Mabel went to her room. She did not light the lamp. She stood in the darkness, looking out the window at the vast, star-dusted sky. The wind had risen again, and it moaned around the corners of the house. A lonely, desolate sound. She was an imposter, a barren woman in a house that needed to be filled with life. She was a nurse who had tended to a wound, but she could not heal it. The town was right. Silas needed sons. Eliza needed a young, vibrant mother who could give her brothers and sisters. He needed a future, and she was inextricably tied to the past, her own and his. To stay now would be an act of selfishness. It would be to deny him and Eliza the life they deserved, the life the world was so clearly offering them. Her quiet work was done. She had opened the windows and let in the light. She had nursed the family back from the brink. Now it was time for a real wife to take over. With a final, deep sigh that carried the weight of all her lost hopes, Mabel bent down and pulled the valise from under the bed. She placed it on the quilt and opened the lid. Slowly, deliberately, in the pale moonlight. She began to fold her spare dress. She would leave before dawn. She would not say goodbye. She would slip away as quietly as she had come, a shadow returning to the shadows, leaving the house ready for its new mistress, for the ringing laughter and the promise of sons that she could never provide. The night was a vast, silent ocean, and the moon was a sliver of bone adrift in the dark. Mabel sat on the edge of her bed, the valise open before her, a hollowed-out feeling in her chest. Each item she folded: her spare dress, her nightgown, her small collection of well-worn underthings, was a final, formal goodbye to the life she had briefly, foolishly, allowed herself to imagine. The scent of Clara May's apple pie, a phantom of cinnamon and triumph, still seemed to linger in the house. It was the scent of her own defeat. She worked methodically, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a nurse preparing a body for its final rest. There was no anger, no bitterness. There was only a deep, weary ache, a sorrow that had settled into her bones. The town was right. She was a placeholder, a temporary patch on a wound that required a more permanent, more youthful healing. To stay would be to stand in the way of the future, to selfishly cling to a comfort that was not hers to claim. She would be gone before the sun rose, a ghost slipping out of a house that was already full of them. She had just closed the lid of the valise, the soft click of the latch sounding like a gavel in the quiet room, when a small sound came from the hallway. A soft, shuffling footstep, followed by a creak of the floorboards outside her door. "Mabel," a tiny voice whispered, barely audible. Mabel's heart clenched. She froze, her hand still on the valise. "Mabel, are you awake?" Eliza whispered again. The doorknob turned slowly, and the door opened a crack. revealing a sliver of the small, night-gowned child, her face pale in the moonlight. I had a bad dream. In an instant, the cold resolve in Mabel's chest melted away. The practicalities of her departure, the logical reasons for her leaving, all of it evaporated in the face of a child's simple, nocturnal fear. She stood and opened the door wider. "Come here, little one," she said softly, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. Eliza padded into the room, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. Her sky-blue eyes, wide and dark in the gloom, went straight to the valise sitting on the bed. She pointed a small finger at it. "Are you leaving?" she asked. There was no panic in her voice, only a profound, heartbreaking certainty, the same knowingness she'd had by the oak tree. The lie died in Mabel's throat. She could not lie to this child. She sank back onto the bed, the mattress sighing under her weight. I was thinking of it," she admitted, her voice a near whisper. Eliza walked over and climbed onto the bed, settling herself beside Mabel. She didn't cry or plead. She simply leaned her small, warm body against Mabel's side and laid her head on her shoulder. The dream was about the wind, she said, her voice muffled against Mabel's dress. It was trying to blow the house down. And you weren't there. Mabel wrapped an arm around the child, pulling her close. The scent of sleep and clean linen rose from Eliza's hair. This small, solid weight against her was the most real thing in the world. It was more real than the whispers of the town, more real than the pretty face of Clara May Thompson, more real than her own fears of being found wanting. It was a simple, undeniable truth this child needed her. "It was just a dream," Mabel soothed, stroking her hair. "I'm here." "Stay until the morning?" Eliza asked, her voice small. "Yes," Mabel said, the word a surrender and a vow. "I will stay until the morning." The next morning was Sunday. The temporary reprieve Eliza's nightmare had granted Mabel had solidified into a painful, awkward reality. She could not leave now, not in the bright light of day, not with the child clinging to her hand. She put the valise back under the bed and went about preparing breakfast as if nothing had changed, but a shadow of impending departure hung over her every move. It was Eliza who announced, "Over a bowl of oatmeal. We are going to church today." It was not a question. Silas looked up from his coffee, his expression a mixture of surprise and his usual grim reluctance. The Banning family had not set foot in the Dust Creek Community Church since the day of Eleanor's funeral service. It was another place haunted by her ghost, a place of public gathering that Silas, in his self-imposed exile, had meticulously avoided. "We don't go to church, Eliza," he said, his voice flat. "We do now," Eliza insisted, looking from her father to Mabel. "Mabel will come with us. Everyone needs to see." Silas's gaze flickered to Mabel, a question in his stormy eyes. Mabel gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. The last thing she wanted was to parade their strange, undefined family unit before the judging eyes of the entire town. It felt like a deliberate act of masochism, but Eliza was not to be deterred. Her small chin was set with a stubbornness that was the exact image of her father's. The battle was short and silent. In the end, as always, the child's will was stronger than the man's grief. With a heavy, resigned sigh, Silas stood from the table. "Get your good dress on," he grumbled, and the matter was settled. The walk to the small, white-steepled church was a gauntlet. Silas walked on one side of Eliza, his face a thundercloud, his big hands clenched into fists at his sides. Mabel walked on the other, her head held high, her posture a practiced imitation of composure. Eliza, holding both their hands, was the small, innocent bridge between their two islands of silent misery. Every eye was on them. Mrs. Gable, standing on the porch of the general store, gave a sniff of disapproval. The men who usually loitered by the saloon soberly tipped their hats, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and pity. As they neared the church, They saw the Thompson family arriving in a smart-looking buggy. Clara May, dressed in a fetching blue dress with a matching bonnet, looked over and her smile faltered for a fraction of a second when she saw the three of them. Then she recovered, offering a bright, pitying smile that was aimed somewhere over Mabel's head. Inside, the church was already warm and stuffy, smelling of old wood, hymn books, and the faint, sweet scent of the ladies' toilet water. The congregation turned as one to watch them enter. The whispers were like the rustling of dry leaves in every corner. Mabel felt the force of their collective gaze as a physical pressure. They found a pew near the back, an empty space that seemed to be waiting for them. Silas sat down heavily, his shoulders hunched, a prisoner in the stocks. The service began. Reverend Brown, a kind man with a gentle voice and a slightly flustered air, spoke of community, of forgiveness, of bearing one another's burdens. Every word felt to Mabel like a personal indictment. She did not hear the sermon. She heard the judgment of the town. She doesn't belong here. She is too old. She is barren. She is standing in that young girl's way. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, and planned her escape. Tonight, as soon as Eliza was asleep, she would slip away. This public humiliation would be her final penance. The sermon ended. The final hymn was sung. Mabel was just beginning to breathe a sigh of relief when Reverend Brown held up his hands, a benevolent smile on his face. "Now, before we depart for a beautiful Sunday afternoon, I thought we might do something a little different for the children," he announced. "They've been so good and patient. We're going to play a little Bible game to test their knowledge." A low murmur of approval went through the congregation. Several children, including Eliza, sat up straighter in their pews, their fates eager. Mabel's stomach tightened. The Reverend asked a few simple questions. Who was swallowed by a great fish? A young boy shot his hand up. Jonah, correct. Billy, who slew the giant Goliath. Several children shouted the answer. It was all very light-hearted, a pleasant end to the service. Mabel kept her eyes down, willing it to be over. And then, the Reverend's kindly gaze fell upon their pew. "And now, a special one," he said, his voice gentle. "I see little Eliza Banning with us today. It is so good to have you here." "My child?" He paused, and his next words were spoken with a gentle, slightly clumsy attempt at pastoral care. It was a question born of innocence, meant to be a simple confirmation of a sad, known fact. "Eliza," he asked, his voice echoing in the suddenly quiet church, "in our Bible stories, everyone has a mother. Can you tell us all, who is your mother?" He expected, Mabel knew, for the child to say, "My mother is in heaven." It was the proper, catechized answer, the one that would elicit nods of sympathy from the congregation. But Eliza did not know the proper answer. She only knew the truth. In the ringing silence, she slid off the pew and stood in the aisle. She was a tiny, solitary figure in the vast, silent space. She did not look at the Reverend. She turned, her movements deliberate, and looked directly at the row of women who had whispered about Mabel, at Mrs. Gable, at Clara May Thompson in her pretty blue dress. And then she raised her arm, her small finger pointing with an unshakable, damning accuracy. She pointed directly at the woman sitting at the end of the pew, the woman in the plain gray dress with the silvering hair. Her voice, when it came, was not a child's whisper. It was clear and pure and absolute, a trumpet blast in the sacred quiet. "That's her," Eliza declared. The whole church leaned in. "That's my mother. There, my mother is sitting right there." The world stopped. The air in the church seemed to solidify, to press in on Mabel from all sides. The rustling of dresses, the shuffling of feet, the soft coughs, it all ceased. There was only a profound, thunderous silence, a vacuum where sound had once been. Mabel felt 100 pairs of eyes turn on her. They were not just looking. They were piercing, boring into her. stripping away her composure, her dignity, her very skin. A wave of heat so intense it was dizzying washed over her. From the soles of her feet to the roots of her hair, her hands, resting in her lap, began to tremble violently. She looked at Eliza, who stood in the aisle, her arm still outstretched, her expression one of simple, defiant truth. She looked at the Reverend, whose mouth was hanging open, his kind face a mask of utter shock. Then, slowly, she forced herself to look at the man beside her. Silas Banning was no longer a man. He was a statue carved from granite and grief. He sat bolt upright, his back ramrod straight, not touching the back of the pew. His large, powerful hands were gripping the wooden rail in front of him, his knuckles stark white. He was not looking at Eliza, or at Mabel, or at the shocked faces of the congregation. He was staring straight ahead at the stained glass window above the altar. But his stormy gray eyes were seeing nothing. He was frozen, trapped in the crossfire of his daughter's love and the world's judgment, paralyzed in the blinding spotlight of a truth he'd refused to name. The silence stretched and stretched, and in that terrible, unending moment, the three of them, the man, the woman, and the child, were utterly, completely alone, an island in a sea of stunned and silent faces. The silence that followed Eliza's declaration was a living thing. It had a weight and a texture, pressing down on the people in the pews, sealing their lips and freezing their limbs. It was a silence so absolute that Mabel could hear the frantic, panicked drumming of her own heart, a frantic bird trapped in the cage of her ribs. It was Silas who broke the spell. He did not speak. He moved, with a single, fluid motion that was shockingly graceful for a man his size. He rose to his feet. He reached down and took Eliza's hand, his large, calloused fingers gently enveloping hers. Then, without a moment's hesitation, he reached across the small space separating them and took Mabel's hand. His touch was not gentle, it was rough, hard, the hand of a man who worked with iron and fire. It was also surprisingly warm, and it was as firm and unyielding as the man himself. It was not a gesture of affection. It was a claim, a statement. He did not look at her. He looked straight ahead, his jaw set like granite, and he began to walk. He pulled her to her feet, and together, the three of them, the broken man, the unwanted woman, and the fiercely truthful child, walked down the center aisle of the church. They were a single, connected unit, a strange and defiant trinity. The congregation parted before them like the Red Sea, faces a pale, shocked blur on either side. Mabel kept her eyes fixed on Silas's broad, unbending back. She felt the burn of 100 stares on her skin, heard the sharp, indrawn breath of Mrs. Gable as they passed her pew, saw the flash of something unreadable disbelief, anger, perhaps even a flicker of envy in Clara May Thompson's pretty eyes. She did not dare to look at any of them. To meet their gaze would be to shatter. Her only anchor in this swirling sea of humiliation and shock was the unyielding grip of Silas's hand on her own. They stepped out of the church and into the blinding white light of the midday sun. The air was hot and still. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath. Silas did not release her hand. He kept walking, his stride long and purposeful, pulling her and Eliza along in his wake. Their footsteps, his heavy, hers light. Eliza's a small, skipping counter-rhythm were the only sounds in the universe. The main street of Dust Creek was deserted, but Mabel knew that behind every curtain, in the shadow of every doorway, they were being watched. The entire town was bearing witness to this silent, strange procession. Mabel's mind was a maelstrom. Shame, hot and potent, washed over her in waves. She was a fraud, an imposter, exposed in the most public and sacred of spaces, but beneath the shame, another feeling, wild and unfamiliar, was taking root. It was a feeling of fierce, protective pride in the small child who trotted happily between them, completely oblivious to the earthquake she had caused. Eliza had spoken a truth that the adults had been too cowardly or too cruel to see, and Silas, who had walled himself off from the world, had, in a single, silent action, stepped out from behind that wall and stood with them. He had not defended her with words, but he had shielded her with his presence. He had taken her hand. The walk from the church to the forge was the longest journey of her life. The silence between them was not empty. It was packed with everything that had been left unsaid for weeks. It was filled with his grief and her loneliness, with the town's judgment and the child's unwavering faith. When they reached the small, neglected house, Silas stopped, but he did not lead them to the door. Instead, he turned and led them toward the forge, stopping just outside the great shadowed opening where he waged his daily war against memory. He let go of Eliza's hand. "Go inside. Little bird," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "Go and play with your doll." Eliza, who seemed to sense the shift in the air, the adult gravity of the moment, nodded solemnly. She gave Mabel's hand a final, reassuring squeeze and then scampered toward the house without a backward glance. Now they were alone. The wind, which had been still, began to pick up, swirling dust around their feet. It was the familiar, restless wind of the plains, a sound of profound loneliness. Silas still held her hand, but he did not look at her. He stared into the dark, cool interior of his forge, at the anvil that was his confidant, at the hammers that were his voice. Mabel waited, her heart pounding. Her valise was packed and waiting under her bed. This was the moment it would all end. He would apologize for his daughter's outburst, for the public embarrassment. He would tell her that this arrangement was no longer tenable. He would give her some money for the stagecoach and send her on her way. A final, quiet dismissal. She braced herself for the blow. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she almost didn't hear it over the rising wind. "I didn't answer the notice of any other woman," he said, his gaze still fixed on the shadows of the forge. "There were others who wrote. I burned their letters, all of them, except yours." Mabel's throat went dry. This was not what she had expected. "Your letter," he continued, struggling with the words, a man wrestling with a language he had long forgotten. It was plain, honest. It didn't ask for anything. It just offered, like a nurse would. He paused, the silence stretching. "I was a soldier. At Shiloh. I saw what nurses did. They came into hell and they didn't flinch." He turned his head then, and, for the first time, he looked at her, truly looked at her. His stormy gray eyes were stripped of their walls, their defenses. She saw past the grief, past the exhaustion, and into the raw, terrified heart of the man. The soldier's heart. "I am not going to marry Clara May Thompson," he said, the words a flat, hard rejection of everything the town wanted for him. "I am not going to marry anyone else." He took a deep, ragged breath. "It's just that I'm afraid." The confession, when it came, was a simple, brutal truth, stripped of all artifice. It was the secret he had been hammering into silence, the fear he had been hiding behind a wall of sweat and iron. When Eleonora died, he choked on the name, the first time Mabel had ever heard him speak it. When she died, it was like the sun went out, like the whole world went cold and silent. I held her hand, and I felt the life go out of her. And I swore I would never feel that again. I would never let anyone get close enough to leave, to be taken. He looked down at their joined hands, at his large, dark, calloused one covering her smaller, paler, more delicate one. "Every day you have been in my house, it has gotten warmer, brighter. I hear Eliza laughing. I smell bread baking. I see the light coming through the windows. And it scares me to death. Mabel, because all I can think is that one day I will wake up, and the house will be cold and dark again. I am afraid of losing someone again." His words were a torrent, a flash flood of pain held back for years, now finally breaking through the dam. He was not talking to her as a potential wife. He was talking to her as the nurse from Shiloh, the one person who might understand the nature of his wound. Tears welled in Mabel's eyes, hot and sudden. They were not tears of sorrow or of pity. They were tears of profound, aching empathy. He had finally shown her the wound, the festering, hidden injury that had crippled him. And in that moment, all her own hurts, the town's scorn, the sting of being called old and barren, the humiliation in the church, all of it fell away, insignificant in the face of his raw, honest pain. She had a choice. She could offer him the easy comfort of a lie, tell him that he would never lose her, that everything would be all right, or she could offer him the harder, more courageous comfort of the truth. She tightened her grip on his hand, her slender fingers surprisingly strong. "Silas," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the tears that now traced paths through the dust on her cheeks. "I don't need you to marry me out of fear. I have lived my whole life on my own terms. I will not be a wife who is taken on as a shield against ghosts." He looked at her, his eyes full of a confused, desperate hope. "I am not Eleonora," she continued softly. "I am not young and beautiful, and I cannot give you sons. I am a plain woman with gray in my hair and hands that are chapped from work. I cannot replace what you have lost. No one can." She took a step closer, closing the small gap between them, forcing him to see her not as a symbol of loss or a vessel for the future, but as the woman she was, right here, right now. "I don't need a ring on my finger. I don't need promises that you are too afraid to make. I don't need you to stop being afraid. I just need one thing from you." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "I just need to be allowed to stay, and I need to be seen, truly seen, for who I am. That is all I have ever wanted." Her words hung in the air between them, simple, honest, and more powerful than any vow. She was not asking for his heart, which was still buried on a hill behind the house. She was not asking for his future, which he could not yet imagine. She was only asking for the present, for a place, for acknowledgement. The wind whipped her skirts around her ankles and blew a strand of silver hair across her face. Silas reached up his free hand, his movement slow, almost hesitant, and he gently tucked the stray strand behind her ear. His rough fingertips brushed against her cheek. It was a gesture of such unexpected tenderness that it made her gasp. He did not say, "Stay." He did not say, "I see you." He simply stood there, in the swirling wind, holding her hand, his thumb beginning to slowly, rhythmically, stroke the back of her wrist. And for the first time, the tormented, stormy gray of his eyes began to clear. He was not a man who had been healed, but he was a man who had finally, after a long and terrible war, allowed the nurse to come in. The walk back to the house was a silent pilgrimage. The world, which had been a cacophony of judgment and fear, had shrunk to the small, warm space between Silas's hand and her own. He did not let go, not even when they reached the front door. He simply opened it and led them inside, the three of them still connected, a chain forged in a moment of public crisis. That evening, a profound change settled over the small, quiet house. The silence at the dinner table was no longer a thing of tension and unspoken grief. It was a soft, protective blanket. It was the quiet of a harbor after a long and brutal storm. Silas still did not speak of what had happened, but he looked at her. Across the table, his stormy gray eyes would meet hers, and in them, she saw not a husband's affection, but a soldier's gratitude, a comrade's respect. He saw the nurse who had not flinched. He saw the woman who had stood her ground. He saw her. Later, after Eliza was asleep, Mabel went to her room. The valise sat on the floor, a stark reminder of the departure she had planned. For a long moment, she simply looked at it. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath that released the last of the day's tension, she knelt, opened the lid, and began to unpack. She put her spare dress in the small wardrobe, placed her brush and comb on the washstand, and slid her Bible onto the small bedside table. When she was done, she took the empty valise and pushed it into the deepest, darkest corner of the wardrobe, burying it under a spare blanket. She was not a guest anymore. She was home. The next few days were a quiet unfolding. The town, having witnessed the public drama, seemed to be holding its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. When Mabel went to the general store, the silence that greeted her was different. It was no longer the sharp, cold silence of judgment, but a thick, baffled silence of confusion. Mrs. Gable was as sour as ever, but her insults were now unspoken, confined to the tight purse of her lips. The other women looked at Mabel with a new, grudging curiosity. She was no longer just the old mail-order bride. She was the woman Silas Banning had publicly claimed, a mystery they could not solve. Only Millie Peterson greeted her with open arms and tears in her eyes. "I knew it," she whispered, squeezing Mabel's hands over a bag of beans. "I knew there was more to that man than rust and sorrow. That child sees the truth of things." Silas did not propose. There was no bended knee, no flowery speech. Such things were not in his nature. His proposal came 3 days later, as blunt and solid as a piece of iron from his forge. He came into the house at midday, his face clean, his manner unusually deliberate. He sat at the kitchen table where Mabel was peeling potatoes and watched her hands for a moment. "The circuit judge, Reverend Hawley, will be in Dust Creek on Saturday," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He sets up at the town hall to handle deeds and such. He performs marriages, too." He paused, his gaze steady and direct. "We will be there." It was not a question. It was a statement of intent, a destination on a map. He was not asking her to marry him. He was telling her that on Saturday, they would be married. It was the most romantic thing she had ever heard. Mabel's hands stilled on the potato she was peeling. She looked at him, at his serious, determined face, and a slow, quiet joy. A feeling she had thought long dead bloomed in her chest. "Yes, Silas," she said, her voice soft. "We will." The days leading up to Saturday were filled with a quiet, purposeful anticipation. There were no grand preparations. They were not a young couple starting a life. They were two weary travelers finally agreeing to share the same road. Yet, there was one matter that occupied Mabel's mind: her dress. She had only two, her plain work dress and the dark gray traveling dress she had arrived in. It was a good, sturdy dress of respectable wool, but it was a garment of sorrow and loneliness. It was the dress of the woman no one had claimed. She took it out of the wardrobe and laid it on her bed. It was travel-worn, a bit frayed at the cuffs from her long journey. As she was examining it, Eliza came into the room. "Is that your wedding dress?" she asked, her blue eyes wide. "It is the best dress I have, little one," Mabel replied with a small, sad smile. Eliza's brow furrowed. She ran a small finger over a place on the sleeve where a button had come loose. "It looks tired," she said with her usual, startling perception. "It needs help to be happy." And so, the dress became their project. They sat together in the afternoon light that streamed through the clean window, a small pile of Eleonora's old sewing things between them. Mabel showed Eliza how to thread a needle, how to make a small, neat stitch. Eliza, with painstaking concentration, sewed the loose button back on the cuff. Her stitches were large and uneven, a child's clumsy work. But Mabel looked at them with a love so fierce it made her throat ache. This was not the mending of a dress. It was the mending of a life. Eliza found a small length of dark blue ribbon, the same color as her own eyes, in the bottom of the sewing basket. "For here," she said, pointing to the plain collar, "so it can see the sky." Mabel carefully stitched the ribbon along the collar line. It was a small, simple embellishment, but it transformed the garment. It was no longer the dress of a lonely traveler. It was now a dress touched by the hand of a child, a dress that held a promise of a sky-blue future. Saturday arrived not with a fanfare of trumpets, but with a profound and holy stillness. When Mabel awoke, the first thing she noticed was the silence. The forge was quiet. For the first time since she had arrived in Dust Creek, the rhythmic, punishing clang of the hammer was absent. The wind, the town's restless, sighing ghost, was also still. The air outside the window was calm, and the sky was a vast, clear, unbroken expanse of pale, luminous blue. It was a day holding its breath. They were not married in the church. They were not married in the town hall. Silas had spoken to the judge, and the ceremony was to be held where their new life had truly begun in the open space before the forge. It was not a grand affair. Reverend Hawley, the circuit judge, a portly man with a kind, weary face, stood with his book. Millie Peterson was there, her face beaming, a single, proud tear tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. A few of the other townspeople, their curiosity finally outweighing their judgment, watched from a respectful distance. Mrs. Gable was not among them. Clara May Thompson was nowhere to be seen. Mabel stood beside Silas, wearing her gray dress with its new blue collar. She wore no veil, no jewels. She held no flowers. Her hands, chapped and capable, were simply held at her waist. Silas wore a clean shirt and his best trousers. He looked uncomfortable and out of place without his leather apron, but he stood tall, his shoulders back, his gaze steady. Eliza stood between them, holding both their hands, a small, vibrant link in their newly forged chain. The judge's words were simple, the traditional promises of love and honor, of sickness and of health, when he asked Silas if he would take this woman to be his wife. Silas looked not at the judge, but at Mabel. His stormy gray eyes were clear. "I will," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath their feet. When the judge asked Mabel, she looked at the man who had been a ghost, at the child who had been her anchor, and at the still, blue sky that held the promise of a peaceful tomorrow. "I will," she whispered, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable joy. There was no ring. Silas had no gold to give her, and she had no need of it. Instead, after the judge had pronounced them man and wife, he simply reached out and took her hand in both of his touch a silent, binding vow. It was over. There was a smattering of polite applause from the onlookers. Millie rushed forward to hug them both, but in the midst of the quiet celebration, it was the Reverend, the man who had unwittingly started it all, who knelt down on one knee so that he was eye level with Eliza. "Eliza," he said, his voice full of a gentle, wondering curiosity. "That day in the church, I have to ask, how did you know? How were you so sure that she was the one?" Eliza looked at the Reverend, and then she looked up at the woman who was now her mother. She looked at Mabel's kind face, at the lines of weariness and care around her eyes, at the gentle strength in her smile. The child's answer, when it came, was the simplest and most profound truth in the world. It was the answer to every question Dust Creek had ever had about the strange, quiet woman who had arrived on the stagecoach. "Because," Eliza said, her voice clear and pure in the still air, "she was the first one who knew I needed to be loved." Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like this video, and support us by hitting the hype button to help more people hear this story.